Dr. Butler, you have been in the middle of this fight. You teach at Flagler College. You've been there, you have spoken out, you've stood up. We cannot tell you how much we appreciate that. We just heard Miss Maite Garcia talk about the fear that has been created among educators across the state. Can you situate us in your struggle and what you have experienced over the past 18 months?
Yeah, what I've experienced in the past 18 months is something that I never anticipated encountering when I entered this profession, quite frankly. What has kept me going is that I know what the historical truth is. If the people that I study and the topics that I present to students, if the people who lived that history, Dr. Scott, can go through literally losing their livelihoods and in some cases their lives for the right to fulfill all of the citizenship privileges that comes with being an American, then the very least that I can do is insist upon my right to teach those stories, right? The other thing is, with my experience where I am fortunate, where I recognize that privilege and I recognize how fortunate I am, is that so many other teachers, K through 12 teachers or teachers at public institutions, higher education institutions, state colleges, have reached out to let me know how thankful they are that someone somewhere is willing to say, look, this is what we're doing. This is what history is. This is why what we do is important and essential in the education of college age students and beyond. So, you know, I'm in a position, luckily enough, where, yeah, there are challenges and there are obstacles, but it's also given me a platform that I feel like I've been preparing my whole career to assume.
Why do you say that? You said that was not the part I expected you to say. I'm not surprised knowing you that you said that, but why do you say you've been preparing your whole career for it?
You know, it starts with the power of education, and it starts with the power of specifically a history education. I wasn't born knowing all that I do about the topics that I teach. I had to learn it. And when I learned it, I realized that I had not been taught the truth in my own educational process. So that was one thing. I can speak to the power of education, and more specifically, the power of a history-based education that emphasizes the stories of those who have been marginalized in our democratic struggle. So there's that. The other thing that I think has prepared me for this moment in time is that I have been trying to engage the public more and more, particularly since I've been at Flagler College. Being able to speak to teachers groups, being able to speak to community groups, being able to speak at churches like this, right? Where I could have two people in the audience, and I used it to become better at how I present my topics to those who are interested and want to learn more. So being able to take what we learn in the ivory towers and apply in the classrooms to the community, that's not a skill set that all scholars have, as you probably well know. So being able to testify personally to the importance of a history education, being someone who has taken the power of this story, these stories, these topics to community groups and being able to work through that, being now a published, recognizable scholar within my field when it comes to Florida civil rights, that's a component too. It gives legitimacy. And then, I mean, let's not ignore the elephant in the room, or maybe we should say, let's not ignore the redneck in the room. Being someone who looks like me and has this accent, testifying to the importance of Black history for the American experience, hard stop, is something that I take very seriously as a position that many people don't have. So over time, Dr. Scott, I think that all of these things have prepared me to do the right thing by those who, through no fault of their own, aren't in the position to do so.
It is a beautiful and wonderfully other-centered way of acknowledging the path that you are on. And I just want to tell you, I appreciate you for that. And I know you, I consider myself to know you fairly well, and I know your heart, so I know you speak truth. I have one more thing I'd like to ask you before I bring in Professor Orlando Paisana, who also teaches here in Florida, and would like to ask you a question. This fall, you are putting on a conference that will teach teachers. I am very proud to say that the Institute for Common Power is one of the sponsors of that. Thank you for asking us to engage with you in that incredible work. But it hasn't necessarily been an easy path for you to put this thing on that seems like it should be without any kind of conflict because you're teaching teachers. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, the conference actually, the idea germinated in an experience that I had with the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale University, right? I had the extreme privilege of being asked to participate in a conference that was titled Teaching Race and Slavery in the American Classroom. And the thing that kind of dawned on me was that as we were going through the action steps, right? One of the things that I really appreciate about this forum thus far is that you have asked everyone, what can we do to help? When those questions came up at this conference, I went down the checklist. Yeah, that sounds great. Can't do it in Florida. Yep, that would get teachers suspended. Yeah, that's illegal now. So the idea that I had was, let's talk about how to confront complex themes in contested spaces, specifically places like Florida, right? So with that idea, bringing it to Florida and having institutional partners like the Institute for Common Power, like the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale University, like the Duke University History Program, like the National Council for History Education, having those supporters to say, yes, this is a conversation we need to have is really, really important. And Dr. Scott, the idea has evolved. It started out primarily as an academic-based conference, but it evolved into something different very fast. And what I've realized in planning this event is the fact that there are people in K through 8 who are teaching. There are people in the secondary schools. There are librarians who are dealing with book bans and literally empty bookshelves.
Yep.
There are public educators. There are museum education departments. There are public historians. Yeah. There are a variety of different groups in this state that are dealing with the ramifications of the legislation in ways that they're trying to wrap their minds around and trying to develop strategies to confront. So the refrain that I kept hearing is, I'm so glad we're having this event. How can we participate? So what began as primarily an academic conference has evolved. And we do have a variety of really strong academics. David Blight, Pulitzer Prize winning author of the Frederick Douglass biography, for one. But we also have Kenneth Davis, who was really popular with our secondary civics and history teachers, who wrote the Don't Know Much About History series. He's coming to attract teachers. The conference is going to be free. It's not going to charge anyone anything to attend. And what we want to do on the campus of Flagler College from September 27 to September 29 is have an event that bridges these divides, breaks down silos, and discusses how we can share resources and help each other. Because, you know, as I said earlier this morning, first they came for the K through 5, then they came for the middle schools, and then they came for the libraries, then they came for higher ed. What's going to be next? The snowball continues to build as it's rolling down the hill. We don't know. But that's the idea behind it. And the title of the event is teaching the freedom to teach.
Perfect.
Confronting complex themes in contested spaces. So more than anything else, it's going to be an event where we can share ideas, share experiences, share resources, and strategize for how we can best assist each other when conflicts arise through no fault of our own within our own classrooms, libraries, and public history spaces.
Bravo. Well, Dr. Butler, thank you very much for putting that on. We are very proud to have a small role in this. Thank you for inviting us into that. Before you teach, you're going to teach for us. You're going to teach us a lesson today on civil rights in Florida. And I know some people are thinking out there, civil rights, am I correct? Is that the lesson today?
That is right. It is about the big picture of the civil rights movement in Florida.
Okay, perfect. And some people, most people, I would say, are many people woefully unaware of the expanse of the civil rights movement right here, including in the town where you live, St. Augustine. Before we get to that, one more question for you. Professor Orlando Paisana has a question he'd like to come in and ask.
Dr. Butler,
Hello.
we were having a conversation earlier when talking about DEI. And one of the things we started to discuss was what it was like prior to this second administration of Ron DeSantis, looking at the DEI initiatives of the many institutions of higher learning here throughout the state. We had pretty robust budgets. But with this new law, what does it mean for those who teach gen ed curriculum at the state college system in Florida?
It means that we're going to have to rethink a lot of things that we took for granted. It means we are going to have to make sure that our pedagogical approaches are sound. It means that there are going to be challenges to what it is that occurs in the classroom that we are prepared to address, but we need to anticipate that those challenges are going to come. As we talked earlier before, 2020 really changed everything. Dr. Jeffries was very persuasive in his analysis of what 2020 meant. And 2020 is when we saw a turning point. And it was not just because of Black Lives Matter. It had a lot to do with it. The fact that you've got not just white people, but you have young white people who are in the streets demanding an end to systemic racism. But you also had COVID and government lockdowns and a public health crisis that brought out the worst in some of our fellow Americans. So when you take those two, put it together, 2020 is the turning point, and we are trying to adjust our previously taken for granted careers and curriculum much more seriously because the scrutiny is going to increase. But there's hope. We've heard often that there are glimmers of hope, and we have to find those glimmers of hope. And those glimmers of hope in what I do is that we rely on primary sources. We don't make this stuff up. You want us to teach history? We will. You want us to teach Letter from Birmingham Jail? We will. And you know what? What separates the professional from the amateur is the ability to give context. So, as a trained scholar, I'm doing a professional disservice. I am practicing historical malpractice if I talk about the Letter from Birmingham Jail and don't give the reason why Dr. King is in Birmingham, why he's arrested, and the impact that letter is going to have on the coming of federal legislation.
Right.
So because we teach primary sources, we're on solid ground, baby.
That's right. Well stated. Dr. Butler, thank you for being here. Dr. Butler, I should say, he is here with us in St. Petersburg at the Greater Mount Zion AME Church. He has been here since 7:30 this morning, I think, and he's helped us host a bit. He's talked to people, and he is here now to teach. Thank you so much.
I am, and I feel kind of like with the white background that I need to hold up a newspaper as they used to back in the day to show that, yes, I am in St. Petersburg and that I do have an audience here and that this is not recorded. Nevertheless, I apologize in advance to the people who came expecting to learn a little about Black popular music in the post-civil rights era. Yeah, it's a lot more fun to talk about Stevie Wonder and Funkadelic. I mean, come on, who can't get behind the mothership landing? I want to talk about Dr. Funkenstein, but there are more pressing issues at hand. And one of the things that I think all scholars should do is have the ability to listen to those that they're trying to reach, right? What do we need at this moment in time? So, very early on, I came to you, Dr. Scott, and said, I think I'm going to pivot. I think what I'm going to do is give the context for the Florida movement. I want to talk a little bit about, as the PowerPoint indicates, I want to talk about, state, local, and national campaigns. The civil rights movement in Florida. You see, this moment in time that we're going through now did not develop out of thin air. This situation that we're in is part of a much longer historical pattern. And what I want to do today is give the viewers an introduction and hopefully to whet the appetite somewhat on what the civil rights movement in Florida looked like then, how it evolved, how it changed, and how it stayed the same, right? The old change in continuity ideologies. So I usually call this state, local, national campaigns. And that in and of itself is going to give part of the importance of the Florida story. Now, let's start with the outside perception, right? The outside perception of Florida is that it's the Sunshine State. From the earliest Spanish explorers / conquistadors all the way through William Bartram to Harriet Beecher Stowe to Henry Flagler. They described Florida as this wonderland, this area of flora and fauna and exoticism and sunshine and beaches. It is the idea that Florida somehow is different than the rest of America. You see on the postcard, the Sunshine State. Florida has always had a great PR agent. It has attracted people to its beaches. It's attracted businesses to the commercial possibilities that exist here. It's attracted the mouse and NASA, right? Not going to pick a fight with him. No, not today. This all accumulates and reflects this idea that's known as Florida exceptionalism. Now, Florida exceptionalism, when we look at African-American history or the civil rights movement in particular, it's this idea somehow that Florida's different. That Florida is outside of the national narrative, but most assuredly, it's not like the rest of the Deep South. It's not like our neighbors in Alabama or Georgia. That somehow Florida, because of the sunshine, because of the progressivism, because Florida didn't have a George Wallace, and Florida didn't have racial violence, did it? That Florida was unique, it was different. Well, I'm here to tell you that no, Florida was indeed part of the Deep South. Florida, in fact, establishes patterns that not only reflect regional patterns, but also contribute to national trends. That's where the local, the state, and the national come in, right? That's the perspective, that's the context. So one of the things that I've done on the PowerPoint is to give you guys an idea of how race and racism played a role in the perpetuation of Florida exceptionalism. You want to come to St. Augustine, the nation's oldest city? Well, one of the things that you could do is have your picture taken in front of the slave market. In fact, one of the most popular postcards, one of the most popular postcards that Northern tourists bought was of an elderly African-American in front of the old city slave market. You're buying nostalgia, right? You're buying into this idea that Florida is in fact part of the Deep South. You have postcards of alligators, that exotic Florida creature, attacking African Americans. As a matter of fact, in the corner, you can see that it's, quote unquote, a darkie's prayer. Florida, in its history, is a history of white superiority. And it's marketed for that purpose. It's advertised as the Old South. Even something as benign as the St. Petersburg alligator farm sold fans full of black children that are labeled alligator bait. Black lives in Florida did not matter. So one of the things we have to do is demolish this idea that Florida is somehow outside of the Deep South and that Florida is somehow different than the rest of the nation at this time. It wasn't. And not only was it not, but it presents itself as a place where people know their place. So I think there are 4 reasons overall that Florida should be at the center of the nation's civil rights narrative. 4 reasons. The first of which is the racial terrorism, the violence that consumed the state. Okay, so violence is going to be one reason. I gave the stat earlier this morning, but I'll repeat it again. Between 1880 and 1920, Florida led the nation in per capita lynchings. Not Mississippi, not Alabama, not Georgia. It was more dangerous for a black person to live in Florida between 1880 and 1920 than it was to live in Mississippi. That, for many, is shocking. But it's not just lynchings. It's also community-based terrorism. We can go all the way back to 1820 with the Ocoee massacre. All started because a prosperous landowner named July Perry demanded his right to vote in the 1920 presidential election. It attracted people from throughout the region to wage war against the black community. We know that conservatively, 56 African Americans were slaughtered. It didn't just stop with the people who tried to vote. They went into the community, killing indiscriminately. But we know that there were probably many more who were also killed. Rosewood. There's St. Petersburg. Rosewood in 1923. Again, Rosewood to me is an example of, even when African Americans at this time stayed in their so-called place and prospered, Rosewood was the example of a black community that would thrive in a segregated society, right? This is a Booker T. Washington dream. And that in and of itself attracted the anger, the violence, and the hostility that peaked with a scene that's going to replicate itself throughout the South. And that was a white woman who falsely accused a black man of rape. This is many, many years before Emmett Till, but it's a pattern that's going to persist throughout our region's history, right? So Rosewood, it was a siege, lasted several days. We know that 6 African Americans died, 2 whites were killed, up to 150 people disappeared. And we don't know about Rosewood until the 1980s. Claude Neal, 1934, Mariana in the Panhandle, the last so-called spectacle lynching of the 20th century, which it wasn't, by the way. That was the conclusion after James McGovern published his book on Anatomy of a Lynching about Claude Neal. The interest in lynching, the scholarship on lynching exploded. But just to give you an idea, and this is for informational purposes, this is documented fact. This isn't for shock value. Claude Neal, before he was killed, was forced to eat his own genitals. 1948, Groveland. Willis McCall, the Groveland Four, an episode that became known as Florida's Scottsboro. Gilbert King, Devil in the Grove, wrote a book about the episode, which led us to, in part, the assassination of Harry T. and Harriet Moore in their homes, literally in the comfort of their own bed, on Christmas night, 1951. Harry T. Moore was the first NAACP official assassinated for his activism in organizing teachers and filing lawsuits for the right to vote. He formed Progressive Voters League of Florida and paid for his life. And on it goes. 1960, you think maybe that sit-ins and the violence that accompanied those only happened in places like North Carolina, Tennessee, or Mississippi? No, in Jacksonville, Florida, a sit-in resulted in what was called Axe Handle Saturday, in which unmasked Klansmen and police handed out axe handles and said that they were basically going to end the sit-ins there with physical violence. 1964, St. Augustine, my hometown. The violence there brought SCLC to the ancient city. A community was mobilized. Violence accompanied the activities in St. Augustine. And as a result, St. Augustine, because of the picture in the bottom right of James Brock, a hotel owner, pouring muriatic acid into a swimming pool, this picture was on the cover of the Washington newspaper the day that the vote to pass the Civil Rights Act was held in the Senate. How bad was St. Augustine? Andrew Young himself told me that St. Augustine was the only campaign that SCLC organized in which medical bills exceeded legal costs. Miami, 1968. Pensacola, 1975. Incidents that I documented in my work. Miami, the McDuffie riot in 1980, the Overland riots in 1984, 1989, Liberty City, 2012, Trayvon Martin. Violence was not an anomaly in the state of Florida. It was all too common and a reflection of greater regional trends. That's one of the reasons that Florida should be at the center of our nation's civil rights history. Another thing that I think is really important where we can learn something about the movement by examining Florida is that scholars like to look at the differences in the movement in places like the Mississippi Delta, where it's primarily rural, or places like Birmingham, Atlanta, Nashville, this urban-rural divide, to look at factors like businesses and the chambers of commerce. What role do economics play? What role did plantation agriculture play? Well, guess what? In Florida, you've got both. In Florida, you have a deeply rural interior surrounded by enclaves of urban habitation. Urban habitation that's built largely on tourism. What role did tourism play in the burgeoning movement here? And we can more clearly understand that, yeah, although there may not have been cotton plantations here, there were orange groves, there were turpentine camps, there were fisheries, there were a variety of businesses and industries that were meant to exploit Black labor in rural areas. So you've got both. Of course, the bottom left is on the cover of Paul Ortiz's magnificent Emancipation Betrayed. And it points out the horrors of the convict lease system, which Florida becomes a model for the rest of the South in implementing. So you've got from Ocala to Orlando, from Mims to Miami, from Pensacola to St. Petersburg, different places within the state that compare nicely, both internally and externally, when it comes to understanding the movement. I think that the political approach is really where the Florida of today becomes the America of tomorrow, to quote Billy Corbin, right? Yes, it's related to the tourism. The idea that in Florida, massive resistance, as it's called, using all legal and sometimes illegal resistance to meaningful integration to prevent it from happening. In Florida, the approach is that there is going to be minimized massive resistance so that the state can continue to boost its tourist economy and its economic possibilities. So as I get into this, I don't want you to think that Florida was unique in terms of not integrating as history passes. It actually provides a blueprint that the rest of the nation follows on how to stonewall, how to delay, and how to frustrate meaningful change when it comes to racial affairs in the state. I mean, we can start from as early as Brown v. Board in 1954, right? Brown v. Board, when it was passed, had, Roy Wilkins called it a second Emancipation Proclamation, but it had limitations. And one of those limitations was there was no time frame. Well, where do the defendants look to master a strategy of how we can delay this? They look to Florida. They look to Richard Irvin, who was the Attorney General of Florida, who proposed that there can be an indefinite timeline which would delay implementation of Brown v. Board, not just in Florida, but throughout the nation. Irvin received $10,000 to prepare the case, and it was his draft that led to the decision in what's known as Brown 2. With all deliberate speed. That was a Florida concept. With all deliberate speed. And there were literally congressmen who said 300 years of enslavement, 300 years is all deliberate speed before we can fully integrate. So Florida literally provided the blueprint. The Pupil Assignment Law in 1956, another very common political tactic, legislative tactic that was used to delay. What the Florida Pupil Assignment Law does in 1956 is pass implementation of school integration plans to the county. So in other words, there's not going to be a major state law that's going to implement desegregation in all schools simultaneously. We are going to ask every single county to develop their own standards. And those integration standards were, and I quote, based on sociological, psychological, and other social scientific factors, as well as would prevent socioeconomic class consciousness among pupils in determining student assignment. What does that mean? Who knows? That was for the individual county to decide. And for some, it meant that you met the criteria, but the sociological concern that we have for your child's well-being means your application is denied. The Pupil Assignment Law resulted in tokenism as a means to delay meaningful integration. And then you look at the first school in Florida that was integrated in Dade County, Orchard Villa. Orchard Villa accepted its first Black pupils in 1961. Within an academic year, it was all Black. So we could introduce white flight to the mix in 1962 in Florida, if we wanted to go that route. Leroy Collins, as one biography called him, the Floridian of the century, right? He is the model Southern governor because in 1960, he is the first political leader in the state, well, really in the South, the first executive in the South, to say that he represented all Floridians, quote, whether that person is Black or white, whether that person is rich or poor, or whether that person is influential or not. Yeah, he's the first Southern governor to speak about the moral necessity of the end of segregation. But his term was up in 1960. He had absolutely nothing to lose in this state when he basically said the controversial, I represent all Floridians. Not only that, but he also, in 1954 with Brown, blamed the NAACP for forcing the issue. Moderation, though, when compared to Ross Barnett, Orville Faubus, and George Wallace, meant that Leroy Collins comes out looking like a much more progressive governor in terms of race relations than he was. 1968, the political worm has turned. This is an incredible stat. Florida of today is the America of tomorrow. In the 1968 presidential election, Richard Nixon and George Wallace got 70.8% of the statewide vote. In 1968 in Florida, Richard Nixon and George Wallace get combined 70.8% of the vote. When does Florida begin to, as we say, turn red? You can start with 1968. So the political approach: delay, stonewall, frustrate through legislative vagueness, and letting individual school districts determine the best course of action. The more things change. But let's not miss one of the big points. The fourth point is that as long as there has been injustice in this country, as long as there has been injustice in Florida, there has been resistance to that injustice. And when we talk about hope, we have to talk about the local people. We have to talk about activism. For as long as there has been racial terrorism, there has been resistance to that terror. People like Harry T. Moore, people like Reverend H.K. Matthews, the SCLC in 1978 is in Escambia County. SCLC. We have Reverend C.K. Steele, who brought the Montgomery bus boycott before it was settled in court in 1956, started his own in Tallahassee, Florida. There he is in front of his church, Bethel Baptist, holding a burnt cross. We could go on and on. Mary McLeod Bethune, student takeover of a previously all-white movie theater in Tampa. Dr. King, Andrew Young, Dr. Robert Haling in St. Augustine. Demonstrations led by Florida A&M students throughout Florida history. And this is in St. Petersburg. A core economic demonstration, a boycott. Look, we don't know about the letter from Birmingham jail. We don't know what happens in places like St. Augustine until local people invite those organizations to come in and support them, almost as a last resort. Without local people willing to put their lives and livelihoods on the line, we don't have these stories to share with our students. Local people, activism, organization brings permanent change at the national level. That is the quintessential American story, or it should be. The grassroots connect to the state often connects to the national. So in conclusion, and again, it's just an overview. I've gone through this relatively fast. What are some of the takeaways that I think are important in a topic like this? Well, I think that Florida should be at the center of America's civil rights history because it possesses many features that we see occur elsewhere in the country and continue to permeate the United States today. First, it's the middle and upper classes that hold the line against meaningful integration. It's judges, it's politicians, it's college presidents, it's the powerful who through legislation, who through political action, do everything in their power to retard racial progress. Second, tourism, economic development, outside perception in Florida. Outside perception means more than true equality. Finally, I think it raises questions. The Florida story raises questions about how the power imbalance that characterizes the nation still exists and demonstrates how far we have to go to be a truly integrated society. We learn from Florida that desegregation is not integration and that desegregation is not equality. It's a struggle that persists, and hopefully this brief overview of the past helps us to make sense of the present. Thank you very much.
Thank you for such an educational showcase and presentation, Dr. Butler. My name is Matthew Outkirk. I'm a member of the Common Power ecosystem. I work with them. I came up through Action Academy. And so I kind of did some of that education as well, briefly over 2 summers, or really wholly over 2 summers, but never as in depth because we had such a wide range of states to cover. But I'm curious, being somebody that used to live in Miami for a number of years in my life, what was, and you mentioned it briefly. I just want you to reiterate, what was your hometown in Florida?
Actually, I'm from LA. I'm from Lower Alabama. I'm from Mobile. And my interest in this topic came from my dissertation. And part of it was because Pensacola was, in fact, more part of Alabama than it was Florida. But even within Pensacola, we're part of Florida. Somehow we're different. We're better than the situation that occurs in Alabama. And as I got into the history and the primary sources, I realized that, what happens in Pensacola during the 1960s was relatively uneventful, shall we say. But it's in the 1970s that all hell broke loose. The more I learned about Pensacola was the more I learned about Florida, right? That Pensacola was not an outlier, but in fact, it was part of a greater Florida narrative. There are so many different pieces here that we could talk about. The McDuffie riots in Miami were about police brutality. In Pensacola, one of the episodes that started the tremendous protests that characterized that city was the execution of a Black motorist at the hands of a white police officer, and all of the evidence demonstrates that they planted a gun under his body. So the more, Matthew, that I learned about a case study, the more I learned that that case study wasn't an anomaly, that was actually part of a greater pattern that existed. Now, I think, Matthew, that one of the things that you nailed is absolutely correct, and that is just, on the surface, we're talking about the civil rights movement. But as you go deeper, it's like, wow, there's so much in Florida that's going on. Florida's complex. Florida's big. There are different regions and different cultural habits, different cultural patterns that exist in Florida, which only serve to make that history more complex. But when you look at it from the state level, that's why I say that Florida should be at the center of how it is we understand the national movement, not just the Southern movement, but race relations on a national level. So yeah, the hope is that when people hear a lecture like this, they say, wow, I never knew that happened so close to where I'm familiar with. I want to learn more. And then they realize that, oh, wow, you mean in 1967, there were 7 cities in Florida that experienced what were labeled race riots? I thought that was just in Newark or Detroit or Chicago. Nope, 7 in the state of Florida. So much so that the state legislature formed a subcommittee to investigate what was behind it. You know what was behind it? Racism.
That's right.
So yeah, the more you learn, the more you realize, wow, we're not unique. And the story is deep.
I wanted to ask you what because all over the country we've heard these stories, and there is evidence of white allyship and advocates on the other side that supported minorities all over the country. What did that look like in Florida?
Wow, that's a great question. It depends on the region. And again, that makes it more complex because there is no story of all white people are allies in a location or all white people are enemies in any location. Sometimes it is the economics that encourage business leaders to support movements because they care about green more than they care about white, right? Sometimes it is our Jewish brothers and sisters in a place like Miami. Sometimes it's our Jewish brothers and sisters from outside of the state who come to a place like St. Augustine.
Thank you, Dr. Butler. So today, are these neighborhoods and these these marginalized groups, are they more so unified now, or has there been a history of division there?
No, there's a history of division. There is a definite history of division, both by residential and education, and like I said, government recognition of, and yeah, the incentives that they receive. It is a deeply divided within even the Latino immigrant community. And that's going to complexify things tremendously as well. When it comes to what is it that represents America to these groups, it's very different things. So yeah, the Florida of today is the America of tomorrow, right?